My name is Brett Benheisen. I'm a professor of aviation and chair of the aviation department. Thank you for joining us today. I understand we have several different classes attending, including our aviation law classes. And our guests today are from the FAA, and they are here to talk to you about illegal charters. And illegal charters have been a problem for a long time. I've been in law practice for about 20 years now, and since the beginning of my career have dealt with various illegal charter issues. Sometimes it's intentional. Oftentimes it's pilots that don't understand the rules. And so the FAA has undertaken a big effort to try to make sure that people understand what these rules are. And as part of that effort, they are out there speaking to the public and explaining these things and talking to us about how to identify illegal charters and make sure that we are all operating properly. So I'm going to introduce our first guest today, which is Don Riley. He's an operations inspector with the FAA. And I'll turn it over to Don, and he's going to share his screen and introduce the other guests. And we will get going on this presentation. Thank you. Don, floor is yours.
Okay, thanks a lot, Brett. Bring up the presentation here.
I failed to mention, if you have any questions as we progress, feel free to type those into the Q&A. I'll monitor that, and we'll stop for questions as we go. So there you go, Don.
All right, hope that looks good to everybody there.
Yeah, it looks good, Don.
Okay, great. Okay, hi everyone, good afternoon. As the old joke goes, we're with the FAA and we're here to help. But really, it is a pleasure to be here today, and we're very excited about this these university outreach missions that we're doing. We're going to share with you all some important safety information that's going out in the world out there these days. And we desire and we invite questions along the way. So as we're talking and discussing, please type any questions that you have into the chat box, and Brett will relay those to you. I would rather you ask them during the presentation discussion, rather than wait till the end, because you may forget them at the end, and it just makes a better flow if we do it in the middle of the presentation. So we appreciate those questions. Again, my name's Don Riley. I'm an aviation safety inspector with the Special Emphasis Investigations Team with the FAA. That is a mouthful, so we go by our acronym SEIT, S-E-I-T. And speaking of acronyms, we're going to try to speak non-government, right? That language that only the feds know. So if we do fall back into that trap, please ask any clarifying questions if we use an acronym that you can't, that we don't explain. So I've been in the FAA for about 20 years, okay, and 16 of it now, almost with SEIT. So I've seen my fair share of illegal charters. Before the FAA, I worked for a couple of small airlines in the DFW area. And before that, I was in the Air Force as a radar navigator in a B-52. With me today, I have two other safety inspectors, Tim Allen and Rob Marchese. And guys, if you'd introduce yourselves now.
Well, good afternoon to everybody. I've been with the FAA 15 years, been at SEIT for 4. Prior to that, I was with the Nashville Flight Standards Office and was able to work with the Part 141 University for about 10 years and enjoyed that very much. And before that, I was on the Metro Police Department in Nashville for 28 years and ended up being in charge of the aviation unit. We had 6 helicopters, and I also did some Part 135 flight instruction and corporate flying on the side. So I'll turn you over to Rob Marchese.
Good afternoon. My name is Rob Marchese. I started flying about 30 years ago is when I was in your shoes going through the University of Nebraska. I went through their program right out of college. I became an airport manager and started up an FBO from scratch. I started a 135 business from ground floor and worked my way up and had a flight school and got into aerial application and banner towing and a lot of flight instruction. I left that after about 6 years and went to the airlines. I flew for a company called Masaba Airlines. And then I went to Air Wisconsin, where I was a captain and instructor pilot for them for quite a few years. Became a chief pilot for a Part 91 company for a couple of years, and then came to the FAA. I've been at the FAA for about 6 years with the Lincoln Flight Standards District Office, and then I've been investigating illegal charters for about 2 years, and with the CIT group just under a year. So I'm happy to be here. And before Don gets started, I just wanted to mention that you all listening here are the next generation of professional aviation personnel. And whether you decide to go into aviation administration or become a professional pilot, there's an extremely high probability that you'll have some sort of exposure to illegal charter in some facet. So as a pilot trying to build time, especially that multi-engine or turbine time, today's presentation will help you make some of those right decisions. So go ahead, Don.
Okay, thanks, Tim and Rob. Appreciate that. So go over our agenda today. We'll start out with some broad overview of what illegal operations are, talk a little bit about operational control. In fact, we're going to talk throughout the entire presentation about operational control. And then some basic regulatory concepts we'll go over. And then we'll get a little bit more specific into illegal charter, what they look like, and then talk about holding out, a term you may or may not have heard before, but we'll explain what that is and why it's important. Talk about red flags, what to watch for when these operations occur. And then specifically for y'all on the discussion today, we're going to talk about your privileges and limitations with your pilot certificate, specifically a private and a commercial certificate. We'll get into expense sharing. That's a real hot button right now. If you own an airplane and you want to, cut the cost down, you can have people on board and share those expenses. Well, there's a legal way to do that and not so legal way to do that. And we'll talk about the do's and don'ts. Kind of wrap it up with resources that are available to you and your questions that you might have after this is done. And then we'll do live Q&A at the end of this discussion. So, and remember, anytime during this discussion, please ask a question. I also want to say, don't be intimidated by what you're going to see on the slides, okay? Our goal is not to make you experts on this today. What our goal is to make you aware of moving forward, that some questions you might ask and some terms you might recognize in the future. And you may stop and go, hey, are we really legal to do this, or is this safe to do? That's really our goal today. So don't get overwhelmed. Okay, slide is stuck.
I hate it when that happens.
Yeah, me too. There we go. See the next slide?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so, it's all about safety, okay? That's why we're doing these outreaches. That's why we're working so hard against these illegal operations. This doesn't look like it, but this was a citation, Cessna Citation 500, and this crash occurred outside of Oklahoma City back in 2008. And the operation of the aircraft, frankly, was a mess. It was owned by a doctor there in Oklahoma City area. It was managed by another company, and that company leased it out to an actual 135 charter operator. Problem was that charter operator was only authorized helicopters. And they, in turn, illegally chartered it out to businesses there in the local Oklahoma City area. And unfortunately, the passengers in the back of this airplane thought they were on a legitimate charter. We show this slide as an attention grabber, and it is certainly that, but also as a reminder that sometimes catastrophic things do occur on operations like this. Right now, it is a white hot spotlight illegal charters. Congress is involved, FAA is involved clearly. Industry partners like National Air Transportation Association or NATA, they're involved with their members, because besides the safety aspect, this affects legitimate operators and takes business away from them. So they are really on this too. Okay. Some key concepts today, and I want to mention some terms you're going to hear, and some of you may be familiar, some of you may not be, but if you hear Part 91, okay, that's the general operating rules, right? It's kind of a baseline for safety. It's basically owner-operator flights. If you hear Part 119, that's the air carrier certification rule, how air carriers become air carriers and get certified by the FAA. And then you'll certainly hear Part 135, and basically that's on-demand operations, or better known as charter operations. So just keep those three things in mind: Part 91, Part 119, and 135 as we move forward. Okay, so in general, when we say illegal operations, what are we talking about? Well, it's operations that are conducted under Part 91, right? But they should be conducted under Part 135 with an air carrier certificate or operating certificate. They're often disguised as Part 91, right? To fly underneath the radar, literally, and they are a safety problem, right? Because they don't operate under the same safety rules that a legitimate carrier operates under. All right, operational control. You're going to hear this term your whole career, right? And basically, operational control, it's a safety pillar that the FAA operates with, and industry and airlines operate with. In general, it is who is in control of the flight and who's responsible and liable for the safe operation of that flight. And you can think of it in three huge basic terms, okay? One would be a legal aircraft, two would be a legal crew, and three would be flight management. And of course, that's a huge umbrella, and that basically takes into account all the operational facets of a flight. Okay, just some basic concepts, okay? Talk about two things: operate, and then we'll give you the actual definition of operational control. So you might think you know what operate means. So you would think, well, it's the pilot manipulating the controls of an aircraft, right? He's operating the aircraft. Well, that's part of it. But it can also mean, when we're talking about an aircraft, to use an aircraft, to cause to use that aircraft, or to authorize the use of that aircraft. So that opens up, the box of who can be an operator. It could be the owner of the aircraft. It could be a Part 135 operator. It could be some other entity, either through a lease or some other kind of agreement. So operate is pretty broad, okay? So keep that in mind. And then operational control, which we just talked about in general, the technical definition is the exercise of authority over initiating, conducting, and terminating a flight. That's the actual rule. So let's see. Rob, did you have any comment on that?
Yeah, thanks, Don. I was just going to mention, after reading the definition of operational control, if you think of an American Airlines flight, does a captain have operational control? Or does a King Air pilot for a 135 company, does the pilot in command, do they have operational control? And the answer is no. And we'll get involved in some later slides, but they do not have operational control. Now, pilots frequently believe that because they're manipulating the aircraft in flight, that they are operating the aircraft. But what the pilot does have is pilot and command authority, in which they're responsible for the safety of the flight. a very important role, but different than that of operational control. Operational control deals with the where, the when, the time, and the conditions of flight. So like if you're gonna fly a 135 flight for an operator, they're gonna pick the customers, they're gonna pick the destination, they're gonna pick the time, they're gonna pick everything. All you do as a pilot for a 135 company or for an airline is just show up and fly the trip. The pilot for an airline or an air carrier does not choose that time or day. They just show up and those functions of operational control are the operator or the air carrier themselves. Back to you, Don.
Okay, thanks, Rob.
Don, you might check your mic, maybe near a button or something. I think it's hitting every once in a while.
Is it clicking?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so another thing I want y'all to remember with some basic things as you're going forward in your career is you really need to understand when you get on the airplane, the relationship between the registered owner of the aircraft, okay, who the operator is, may or may not be the owner, right? Yourself and the relationship to those entities, and then the passenger too. Don't forget about them. And some of the things to keep in mind is, who's paying you for the flight? Are the passengers in the back employees of the owner, or are they just riding for air transportation? Basic questions like that as you're moving forward and you get on the airplane and you get new jobs. Just try to understand all those relationships.
That's the most important thing that you need to know is who are the passengers. And if you're flying for somebody that has a family, you know all of them, and then suddenly there's strange people on the airplane, that's the time to start asking questions and wondering what's going on. That for a pilot's always critical, is to know who you're hauling, and that'll keep you out of trouble a lot of times.
Yep. Thanks, Tim. Okay, so indicators of operational control. So you can basically say who's providing the aircraft, who's providing the pilots, who's providing the maintenance, who's providing the insurance, who's scheduling the aircraft, who's providing the fuel, and on and on and on, right? And it comes down to the basic question, who is ultimately responsible for the safe conduct of the flight is how operational control is looked at. All right, wet lease and dry lease, you're going to hear a lot about those today. Some definitions. A wet lease is defined as an agreement where a person agrees to provide an entire aircraft and one crew member, okay? A lot of people think a wet lease is got something to do with the fuel, and that's really not the case. So an aircraft and at least one crew member is a wet lease. A dry lease is not explicitly defined in the rules, but it basically means a mere equipment lease, okay? So an owner lessor leases his aircraft to a person or entity, and then that person or entity just takes the plane, right? They are now responsible for the plane, and they use it and operate it like their own aircraft with no crew member. So that is what a dry lease is. But this is the distinction.
Good examples, Don, is Southwest Airlines needs
Right.
another 737, so they go to a leasing company, obtain a aircraft, they put their pilots on it, they maintain it, and their dispatchers dispatch it. So that would be a good example of a clean, dry lease that works the way it's supposed to.
Yeah, correct. That's a very good example, Tim. And I'll give you an example of a wet lease kind of in today's vernacular, would be an Uber ride, okay? You take out your app and you hail an Uber with that app. What is Uber providing you? They're providing you the car. They're providing you the driver, right? They've got the insurance. They're responsible for getting you from point A to point B, and you're paying them to do it. So that's kind of what a wet lease is. It's still their car. It's still their driver. So that would be an example of a wet lease on the Uber side. But here's what we need to remember, okay? A wet lease, the lessor, usually the owner, retains that operational control. And if they get paid for it, okay, they need to have an air carrier certificate because they're transporting persons or property for hire. With a dry lease, that operational control and the liability, okay, is transferred to the lessee. So that's the whole point of a dry lease, is transferring that operational control and liability. So keep those two distinctions in mind. Okay, so which rules should you operate under? 91 is the baseline, like we talked about. 135 are the on-demand or charter operations. And generally speaking, okay, when you transport persons or property for compensation or hire, you need that air carrier certificate or operating certificate that would be under Part 135, okay? So just kind of keep that generally in mind. The bottom bullet there talks about compensation, and we're going to get into that. And compensation is a little bit more complicated than just money. Okay, so we'll talk about that here in a little bit. And that last bullet also mentions holding out, and we'll get into that here in a little bit too. Okay, so again, generally speaking, if you fly it yourself, you pay for it yourself, and you're responsible for it yourself, Part 91 is generally good enough. But if you're advertising and you're willing to fly others, okay, other people and maybe boxes or property for compensation, then you're going to have to comply with Part 135. And if you're just a passenger, okay, that wants to go from point A to point B, all right, you should expect the higher safety rules that are offered under 135. That's why 135 is there, okay, Part 135 is to protect the flying public, okay, because they are really unawares. They want to pay for a flight and be safe and go from point A to point B in that charter operator, just like they would with Southwest Airlines or American Airlines under those carriers. So, okay, that was a lot of general nuts and bolts and definitions and things like that. Is there any questions right now or clarification that we need to do?
Nothing in the Q&A yet.
Okay, thanks, Brett. All right, let's move on. We'll get a little bit more specific right now. Talk about the importance of understanding what these illegal charters look like. We get a lot of comments on this slide about the black bars on the eyes, and we like to say it's to protect the innocent. And indeed, there is some innocent things going on here sometimes. We put illegal charter operations into 3 categories, okay? The clueless, the careless, and the criminal. The clueless, okay, is just like it sounds. These operators or people just don't have a clue what they're doing is wrong, okay? They don't even know enough or thought about it enough to ask questions and to look in to if what they're doing is illegal or not. They are just indeed completely clueless. And you may ask, is there really people out there like this? And the answer is yes, there is. Okay, the second one is careless. And these are people you've probably heard the term that a little bit of knowledge is dangerous. And that's kind of where these folks fall into. They, somewhere along the line, maybe got some bad advice. They started looking at the rules and they're like, man, these are way too complicated and way too boring. I think I know what I'm doing. I'm just going to go out and do it. I'll be safe. And I think I can do this. That's the careless. And then the criminal are people that actually intentionally go out and skirt the rules and break the rules intentionally. And it was an eye-opening experience when I first got into this unit. Because when I first got with the FAA, I worked with Southwest Airlines, obviously a huge air carrier. And when I got into this unit, people really do things against the rules. And there are people out there that do things unsafe on purpose. Okay, so those are the three categories we put these operations in. Okay, so why do these things happen? Well, airplanes are expensive, right? You got a guy that's got a G5 that's sitting on the ramp, and it's costing a lot of money just to sit there. So there is pressure to put that aircraft to use, right, to offset those ownership costs. They can sometimes do it legally, but a lot of times, there will be illegal flights to offset those costs. Another reason is to avoid fees and taxes. Okay, and the biggest tax that they avoid is federal excise tax, which is 7.5% of the flight. You're charged that when you buy a ticket on American Airlines, you're charged federal excise tax. When you get a charter flight, you're charged federal excise tax. But illegal operations do not charge that, obviously, because they're not following the rules, right? So they can undercut the real legitimate operators right there, right off the top of that 7.5%. They want to avoid costly expense of FAA certification, right? And the continuing oversight of us looking over their shoulder, making sure they're doing things right. So all that gives them a competitive advantage, right, over the legitimate operators. They're in it to make a buck or to save a buck is the bottom line on why these things happen.
They also have to meet additional insurance requirements with the DOT, which generally is more costly to the operator than if they were just doing a Part 91 operation. So that's an additional expense as well.
That's correct. Thanks, Tim. Okay, so on the flip side, authorized operators obviously are held to a higher level of safety, right? They got more programs that they have to comply with, more things they have to get approved, like pilot training, drug and alcohol program. They operate under more robust safety rules. For example, flight and duty time restrictions for pilots. They have a higher maintenance requirements on the aircraft, and we perform more frequent checks on the operations, on the aircraft, and on the crew members, right? So that's your high level of safety that's there. Again, the bottom line is to protect the flying public who is unaware of this stuff and just wants to ride in the back of the airplane. Okay, so let's talk about what they look like and some of the forms they take. And by far the largest and most common one we see is called the sham dry lease, the scam dry lease. It's a scheme. And want to make sure we talked about what a dry lease is, and it can be done legally, okay? But the sham or the scam here is you have a person that hears about an operator down the road, and he needs to go out to Las Vegas. Got a business trip, or he wants to go play golf and gamble, whatever. So he calls this operator up and they say, sure, we can take you out there, no problem. You just have to sign a dry lease for this flight. So they sign the dry lease. And if you remember what happens with a dry lease, that operational control will be then transferred to that passenger. Okay. But that's not what he wants. He wants a flight on a charter operator. He doesn't know he now has the responsibility and, oh, by the way, the liability for this flight by signing that dry lease. Okay. The other part of the scam is that lessor, that operator, he's the one that actually maintains control, right? He provides the pilots, he provides the maintenance. He does everything that a charter operator would do. He gets paid to do it, and he should have a 135 certificate for that higher level of safety than that passenger is not getting now. That's the sham dry lease. talk about Advisory Circular 9137B just a little bit. It is a great document, AC 9137B, and it's written from the perspective of the passenger in the back of the airplane. And it helps these passengers ask certain questions to determine if what they have done could be a sham dry lease, right? Instead of getting on a legal operator. So it's a good document. Part 91 management companies. Okay. Some of you may or may not know that these kind of companies exist and they are perfectly legal. Okay. Someone buys a G5 and they don't want the hassle of hiring the pilots, hiring the mechanics, taking care of the aircraft and scheduling it. So they go out and hire a Part 91 management company. But the key is that owner still maintains a responsibility for operational control. It's not the management company. Where they get into trouble is they will operate that aircraft on the side in illegal charters, and then they have operational control of it. And the people they fly in the back aren't affiliated with the owner at all. So that's when 91 management companies get into trouble. Talk real quick about demo flights or demonstration flights, okay? They are a legitimate way for a prospective buyer to look at an airplane, to demo an airplane, okay? But these days, sometimes illegal charter is disguised as a demo flight, okay? When the aircraft is neither for sale by the owner, nor are the passengers looking to buy an aircraft. Again, they simply want transportation from point A to point B, but the operator says, hey, I'll give you a good deal and we'll call it a demo flight. Okay, that is an illegal charter. Fake flight instruction. We had an operator out on the West Coast advertising online. Hey, come take a flight instruction flight with us. Come take a lesson with us, and we'll fly you from the Bay Area down to, I don't know, Lake Tahoe, right? So when the passengers would show up, they would get a headphones and they would get an iPad, and they would either take a flying lesson on the iPad or they would just surf the internet in their entire flight. Clearly, it was not flight instruction, right? It was just an illegal charter.
Hey, Don, while we're on that subject, I was just going to bring up in a couple of investigations that I've seen. I've seen it where a person there'll be a two-pilot crew type environment, and one person will log as flight instruction, giving dual instruction. And through the investigation that the other pilot logged just pilot and command time, no dual received. And so their logbooks don't quite add up. And I've seen other cases where there'll be two pilots up front and they'll both log pilot and command with no dual received or dual given. So just as a general consideration is when you go fly with another pilot, just kind of coordinate for a legitimate flight, just coordinate with the other person of who's logging what and for what purposes, and just make sure that you follow the regulations on that.
Okay, great point, Rob. Thanks a lot. Okay, and the final bullet there is misuse of expense sharing, okay? And this is a hot button right now. You have an airplane and you want to share expenses, right? To make the trip a little bit cheaper. So there's a legal way to do it and a not legal way to do it, and it's misused quite a bit these days. And we're going to get into that later, but that's another form of illegal charter that we see a lot of. All right, let's talk about that funny term, holding out, okay? Just want you to think of holding out, basically advertising, okay? There's more to it than that, but that's its basis. And why that's important is there's basically two, for our discussion today, okay? There's two kinds of carriers. There's a private carrier, which is, for our discussion, just think of Part 91, it's private, okay? And then there's a common carrier, and for our discussion, that'll be a Part 135. Common carriers carry the public, okay? Advisory Circular 120-12A, and you don't have to remember these, but at the end we'll mention them again if you want to write them down. But anyway, AC 120-12A explains the private and the common carriage, okay, more in depth. But here's the test. It's a 4-pronged test, okay? If a carrier has these 4 things, they're a common carrier, okay? And why that's important is they need to be authorized by us, the FAA. They need to have an air carrier certificate or an operating certificate. So the 4 tests are number 1 is a holding out. It's not 4 tests, it's 4 elements of the test. So a holding out of a willingness or advertising out of a willingness to transport persons or property from place to place for compensation, okay? And why this is important to you guys early in your career, as you go through your career, and Rob mentioned before, you're going to come up on circumstances where you might see holding out, and you're going to hopefully remember this conversation is like, I know that's kind of advertising or something like that. I'm not sure, this might not be legal, okay? Holding out is done a lot of different ways. And advertising in an old-fashioned way is just one of them, okay? So let's talk about the different ways holding out takes place. And remember that this is the first element, right, of being a common carrier. That's why it's important. Okay, so what holding out looks like. It can be done through agents, right? So a regular charter operator has people that will call and drum up business, right? That's an agent. Holding out can be done by reputation or word of mouth. And this is where people get into trouble. And let me give you an example. You're on the 18th green of your local golf course, okay? And Joe, your friend, says, hey, Bob down the road, I fly with him all the time. When I got a business trip, I call him up, or when I want to take a vacation, I call him up, and he's got a great jet and good rates. You ought to give him a shout. Okay, so both these things have just taken place. Bob has a reputation that when people call, he's going to transport them, and the advertising just occurred by word of mouth through Joe, okay? That's holding out. And Bob, the operator down the road, he didn't even know this was happening, okay? But he has that reputation, and people tell other people about him. So that right there is the first element of a common carrier, okay? And that's why holding out is important. Okay, other ways it can happen is through regular advertising and signs, okay? Back in the real old days when there were newspapers, if anybody reads those still, you could take out an ad in a newspaper or a magazine, something like that. It can still happen on the bulletin board at the FBO, the fixed base operator, right? But by far the most common way it happens these days is the internet and social media. We've seen advertising on all the sites listed there and even more. It's just the way to do things these days is via social media. Okay, so that's element 1 was holding out, right? And 2 and 3 were transport persons or property, which is pretty self-explanatory. And number 3 was from place to place, also pretty self-explanatory. And then the 4th element is compensation. So we define compensation pretty broadly. It's, of course, money, okay? It's even the promise of money, that you were promised to get paid or you promised to pay it, okay? Goodwill is a form of compensation. Expectation of future business, I'll funnel business your way. That's a form of compensation. And the one I want you guys to remember out there is accruing flight time is considered compensation, okay? And that gets a lot of people in trouble. In fact, we had a case where a gentleman was advertising on the World Wide Web, the internet, and he would take people and shuttle them to Reno for free. And he was logging the flight time. Well, first of all, he was advertising on the internet to do that. Okay, so he's holding out. and then he's taking people from place to place, right? And his compensation was only the flight time. So we called him up and asked him what he was doing, and he didn't really understand, and we were able to work that out to a good solution for all of us. But that's why you need to be careful about compensation. Okay, red flags. Some of the things you might see in these illegal operations. One I really want to point out is probably that last bullet. Okay, in the future, if your boss tells you to go take this flight, and then someone in the company goes, hey, if the FAA meets you on the other end of the line, you need to brief the passengers on what to say. Okay, that's a huge red flag that something is not good, what's going on with the flight. So just remember that if you're asked to do that, brief the passengers what to say to the FAA, that could be a red flag. Tim, I think you had a good example on this.
We did. One of the investigations involved a situation. Number 3 there says safety or passenger briefing cards. Well, this company actually had operational control briefing cards that were laminated in the aircraft. In the event that a FAA inspector got on board, the lessee could pull out this laminated card and read off of it the elements of operational control. And the major lessee of this probably took over 450 flights. And when we interviewed him, we asked him what operational control is, and he said, I have absolutely no idea. So even with the laminated cards, he wasn't able to come up with the right answer when he was asked it.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. That's a huge red flag if you're supposed to have operational control and you don't know what it means. So anyway. Okay, any questions? Brett, anything in the chat, or we can stop?
No questions yet.
Nothing. Okay.
Oh, we have one coming in here. Let me take a quick look. We do have a question. To what degree are passengers responsible in identifying an illegal charter? Are they equally responsible to have knowingly selected to travel illegally?
Well, are they equally responsible? Well, they're the ones in the back of the airplane, okay? And as we're doing these educational, we've been reaching out to the public, and the hardest group to reach is the passengers, right? Because they're looking for the cheapest flight from point A to point B. They see an airplane on the ramp and they see a pilot with epaulets on his shoulder, and they think everything is correct, right? So they really should think about asking questions of the operator. Are they if they knowingly get on an illegal flight? Well, that's kind of opening up a can of worms. They should be smarter than that, because as we're talking about here, those safety bars are not the same for an illegal flight, right? So they're taking a risk by knowingly getting on an illegal charter. I don't know, Tim or Rob, you got something?
And just to jump on that that question, I think that was a very good question. And typically, passengers are usually the victims. And typically speaking, the regulations that we're referring to, 119 and 135 regulations, they regulate the pilot and they also regulate the operator, and that we don't regulate the passengers. So typically they're just the victim of it. But what we can control is the operators to ensure that they have compliance, and also the pilots to ensure that they're not doing anything illegal as well.
And the danger of the passenger not realizing what they're doing when they sign a dry lease, like Don was talking about earlier, is now they assume all the liability for the flight. So if there's not proper insurance to cover that, they become the operator of the aircraft, and anything that goes wrong, they're responsible for, because they have lease the aircraft, and the lease says they have operational control of it. So that's the thing you need to be cautious about. If you're required to sign documents as the passengers, you may be incurring a tremendous amount of liability.
Yeah, those are all great points, and probably another one, even sitting out there in the audience, if you take a flight on a charter flight, a legitimate operator will never ask you to sign a dry lease. A legitimate authorized operator, that just doesn't happen because they don't need it. They have a air carrier certificate. So, okay, let's talk about privileges and limitations of your private certificate. Okay, before we do that, we're going to state this about 3 times before we're done. Your privileges and limitations, right, are separate of your certificate, are separate and distinct from the operational authority that is required to conduct that flight. For example, if you have a commercial, okay, you can fly for compensation or hire, and you can fly 135 flights, but only if the carrier you're working for is authorized to do that, right? So there's 2 separate things going on there. There's a Part 61 limitation and privilege there, and there's a Part 135. So for that scenario, you would have to be qualified for both. So just remember, they're 2 separate things. All right. So the private pilot privileges and limitations are in FAR 61.113. And in general, okay, you cannot act as PIC for compensation or hire. You can't get paid for it. In general, you cannot act as PIC of an aircraft that is carrying passengers or property for compensation or hire. And I say in general because, like a lot of things, there's exceptions to the rule, right? And one of those exceptions is expense sharing. And we're going to talk about that here in a second. But just to introduce the advisory circular that it's in, expense sharing is Advisory Circular 61-142. But that is an exception to getting compensation when you're a private pilot. Okay, Rob, I think maybe you had a comment on this, or? Oh, still muted.
Sorry about that. I was just going to reiterate Part 119, the definition of Part 119, or the subject of 119 is the certification of air carriers and commercial operators. And that is how air carriers get certified, okay? And then the actual operations occur under 135 or 121. And the same as Don had mentioned, the same thing with 61. 61 is the certification of airmen and flight instructors. And the rule that you operate under is Part 91, is the general operating rules as an airman. So I bring this up because in Part 61, it states certificate privileges, and it talks about some of the privileges that you can do, but you have to distinguish that you can only operate under Part 91. You don't operate under 61. So back to you, Don.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Yeah, we're going to probably beat these 2 things to keep separate like a dead horse, but it is important to remember for sure. So. Okay, commercial certificate. So that's covered under 61.133. If you have a commercial certificate, you can act as PIC for compensation or hire. You can get paid to do a job. And you can act as PIC of an aircraft carrying persons or property for compensation or hire, okay? But again, be careful. You also have to meet the rules that the operation is being operated under with this. Another thing to be careful about that you don't want to get into trouble is you cannot hold out, right, as that pilot to provide that transport. And this happens a lot, okay? We go back to the definition in what holding out, everything it encompasses. Sometimes people don't understand that they're doing it, okay? So that's why you need to be aware of it. And we have a couple of cases, Flight Now and Blackbird cases involving this. And Rob, were you going to comment on this?
Yeah, sure. The Blackbird case was an application on your computer or iPhone. And as a customer, you signed a lease agreement with really no real understanding or the transfer of legal responsibility for an aircraft. And then you would separately choose a pilot for the flight, and you would choose the destination of wherever you want to go. And the Blackbird theory was the fact that you as a lessee or the customer, you could separately choose the aircraft and the pilot, which met the definition that Don had mentioned earlier about dry lease. Well, there was a legal determination from that. And the determination was that the pilots who participated in the Blackbird program were holding out to the public via the app and meeting the definition of common carriage, and therefore contrary to Part 119 air carrier certification requirements. So an important point here is that the lessee, who was really only looking for air transportation, had no idea what the lease actually stood for or what they were actually signing.
And Blackbird also collected all the fees for the airplane and the pilot as well. So they centrally billed the customer, Blackbird did.
Okay, thanks, guys. Okay, mention expense sharing. So what is that, and do's and don'ts, right? So the advisory circular is 61-142, and another really good document to explain the do's and don'ts of expense sharing, because it goes into scenarios that you can do that are both legal and scenarios that might catch you on the illegal side. So it is a great read. But basically, right, you can share expenses, okay, as a private pilot with your passengers, but only those listed in 61-113C. And those expenses are fuel, oil, airport, and aircraft rental fees, okay? That's the only thing you can share. Then on top of that, the FAA has determined that you as the pilot and your passengers have to have a common purpose for going to the destination, okay? You have to have your own purpose, right? You were going to, let's say, from Dallas, Fort Worth to Las Vegas. You had to go to Las Vegas to attend a business conference, okay? You're already going there. And your passengers are going for another reason, okay? You aren't just transporting them to get them there, and you had no business going there, okay? Both the pilot and the passengers have a purpose for going to Las Vegas, okay? That's the first thing. And then the second thing is, as a pilot, you can't hold out to do any of this. You can't advertise to do expense sharing, okay? So that, because if you remember, that meets the first test for a common carrier, one that needs to be certified, is the advertising or holding out. So read that AC if you want to do this, and it will guide you, steer you out of trouble for sure. And then one more time, Part 61 is separate and distinct from the operating rule that you operate under. Just keep those two things separate. Okay, resources. Sorry. So we've got a website, okay, Safe Air Charter on the attached to the FAA. You can find it just by going FAA.gov, or you can use this website that's listed there. National Air Transportation Association has a great website also. You can go to your local office, of course, your local FAST team. We have media stuff on YouTube. In fact, we've got a couple of public seminars that we did about illegal charter. You can look those up. We've got Facebook and Twitter and Instagram to do also. And I believe you guys, if you didn't get it, you will, was a handout that we sent about some different scenarios and questions. Is this legal or not? And, what do I say if I'm offered to do this? Though that handout has these links to the advisory circulars that we've mentioned, okay, and also to the FAA Safe Air Charter website there, and those links should be active and take you straight there. All right, questions, and we'll take all questions, guys. If you want to talk about your career, illegal operations, enforcement, what that looks like. I mean, anything you want to ask, we will answer, and if we can't answer it, we'll get back to you. So,
while you're thinking of your questions, one thing I would like to point out to privileges and limitations. In 119.1 Echo is a list of items that a commercial pilot conduct without an air carrier or a commercial operating certificate. So there it talks about flight instruction and bird chasing and aerial application and sightseeing flights and that sort of thing. So you can refer to that list for a complete list of what you can do without an air carrier or commercial operating certificate.
Yeah, good point, Rob.
All right, well, we do have a question. The question is, you mentioned expenses or taxes of 7%. Could you please elaborate?
Yes, that's a IRS rule that says that the federal excise tax for air transportation is 7.5% of the cost of the flight. And that's assessed hopefully by the operator if they're operating correctly. As Don pointed out, one of the major air carriers, United or American or Southwest, assess that 7.5% federal excise tax for all flights that they provide.
And just to reiterate, that's a red flag if you book a charter, if a passenger books what they think is a charter and they don't get charged that 7.5%, that's a red flag.
Joe, we do have another question, but just real quick so I can let you know, Joe has asked me to remind his students to remember to do their attendance on Blackboard. The next question is, when it comes to internships, if it's unpaid, would logging the flight hours you receive be considered as compensation?
That's a good question, and I'm going to turn it over to my pilot friends.
Well, I don't know that I've got quite enough information. I don't know an internship with regard to what, who are they doing an internship with?
I imagine that they're speaking about some of the internship programs we might have with companies, whether they be corporate flight departments or those types of things. We have several internships like that exist with our program.
Well, if I know with the school that I was associated with, they did internships with the state of Tennessee in their King Air. They had a 90 and a 350. But in that case, the people in the back aren't paying for the flight. It's all state employees. So in that case, it was okay. But I'm not personally aware of any 135 or companies that do internships. I guess if there was an illegal charter company doing an internship, you might have some problems there. If people were paying for air transportation, but it wasn't a certificated entity, I think I'd shy away from that.
That makes sense. Thanks. We have another question here, kind of interesting. How can Uber fly people to JFK in New York City via helicopter?
Well, only if they had a Part 119 certificate. That's what the actual name of it's air taxi for 135. So if you're going to offer people rides in the back with whatever type of aircraft you have then the aircraft has to be conformed to the 135 rules, and you have to operate under a 135 certificate. There's no exception to that. That's really what we're trying to prevent. We're probably on the verge of that with personal type aircraft that are being developed, and there's still a requirement to conform to the Part 119 regulations in order to put people in the back and charge them.
And to answer your question, they do use the licensed air carrier for that transportation that you're referring to. The aircraft are on a 119 certificate.
That's a good question.
Great. Well, we've got a couple of more here. If two people are going to Las Vegas for two different reasons, such as vacation for one and a business trip for the other, and they share expenses, is this illegal under Part 91 if no holding out was done? I know in my classes, and I've taught for years, that the most conservative way to handle this would be to make sure that you are going to the same destination for the same reason. You need to have, the idea is you'd have something in common at that destination besides just the need to get there. But I do think there have been some cases recently where, as long as the pilot was going anyways and they weren't going purely to take the other person, that common destination may have been enough. So that's basically the question here. We've got one person going for a vacation and one person going for a business trip. Is that okay if there was no holding out?
Boy, your class is coming up with some great questions, Brett.
They're a fairly smart group usually.
Well, I'm just going to answer my opinion, and I am not a lawyer, but common sense tells me they both need to go to Vegas, even though their reasons for going there are different. That's probably okay. But again, I'm not a lawyer.
I believe that's directly addressed in the 61-142 advisory circular, that particular scenario. So I'd invite you to read it. It's a wonderful document. It'll help you understand the illegal charter as well as expense sharing. It's very well written.
Just while we're on that subject, now, if I were to go from Grand Forks, North Dakota in a 6th place Piper Lance, for example, and take 5 of my closest friends to a Nebraska football game, and then I drop them off, and I'm going to the football game with them, and we're going to share operating expenses. And then I drop those 5 people off in Lincoln, Nebraska, and then I decide to go back to Grand Forks to grab my next closest 5 friends to bring them down, and all 11 of us are going to enjoy the game. Now, that second trip, my purpose has already been fulfilled. I'm at my destination, and now I'm going to go back to Grand Forks and take another load of people down to Lincoln. Now, that second trip would not be a common purpose.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, you're just transporting that second group there so they can join you at the game. Yeah,
correct.
Very good. The next question is around how these inspections work. Do you randomly find a charter business and inspect them, or do you hear that a charter business is doing something illegal and go check it out? I guess they're kind of wondering how the FAA might find out about these sorts of things.
Typically through complaints. We can develop evidence that something's going on other than that, but the vast majority are complaints, and a lot of times legitimate 135 operators seeing the guy across the field taking his passengers. He had a bid for a trip, he lost it, and the guy across the way that's doing it the wrong way ends up putting his passengers on there and taking them on the flight, and that's frequently what happens.
And if the question was in regards to inspections of legitimate operators, there's 3 basic type of inspectors that inspect 135 operators: a avionics inspector, an airworthiness inspector, which is the mechanic type, and an operations inspector, which is like the pilot type. And all 3 inspectors would have a quarterly requirement of certain things to look at for a legitimate 135 operator every quarter. And so they frequently get visits from the FAA, and we look at training programs and general operations, look at flight duty rest. There's a variety of things that would be inspected depending on that time of year and what's going on, whether it's a winter operation or whatnot. So in case Tim's question didn't answer that question, that's the type of inspections for a legitimate operator.
Okay, this question is specifically for Mr. Marquise. In your Nebraska game scenario, how would the situation change if you picked up friends from different locations in a chain of stops to then all go to the game?
Oh, that's a good question. So if we're looking at multiple stops, so if I'm flying to go pick up a friend and I'm empty and I'm just ferrying the airplane and there's no passengers or cargo or compensation, there's nothing to share. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Now, the minute that I have somebody on board, a passenger on board, and we're going to go to another destination, I mean, are we sharing that expense? And now we have a problem that if we're sharing an expense and we've got people on board and there's compensation. So you're looking at a very, you can easily get into a tricky mess with that if you're going around different destinations, picking up different people for that common purpose. That can quickly get ugly.
Yeah, because after you get two people on board, probably that second person doesn't have purpose to go to another place to pick them up, right? So, yeah, I agree with Rob. It can get sticky real quick.
We have another question. As a pilot, the company I want to fly for needs a 135 and 119 certificate. I don't need anything besides my pilot certificate.
Well, you'd have to be trained and tested depending on what type of operation it was. If it was a single pilot operation, you'd have to really be trained, but not under a formal program. But if it's a basic or a full 135 operation, it would have a authorized training program you'd have to complete, and then you would receive proficiency checks either by a check airman or the FAA, and also a line check, and you'd have to maintain that, and you'd have to be alcohol and drug tested as well and remain on the drug testing program. So that would be generally the requirements that would be required. And of course, you'd have to have the appropriate commercial or airline transport pilot rating according to what kind of equipment you're flying to fly the equipment.
Great. And that's all going to be provided by the particular carrier that you work for. I remember from my Part 135 days, they would go through that training right at the beginning when you first started, and then regular training thereafter.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it looks like there are no other questions.
Hey, Brett, I've got one that we get asked a lot about enforcement. You know, what can happen to me and what does that look like? Like we said at the beginning, we're here to help. It used to be an old joke. Your audience may be too young to remember that kind of tongue-in-cheek joke, but we are here to help, and enforcement can run a wide gambit of outcomes, right? To no action, to revocation, and it all depends on the severity, the intentionality, the careless or the cluelessness. But I will say in general, if you made an honest mistake and you're willing to work and come into compliance, the FAA is going to work with you and try to solve that at the lowest common denominator. The civil penalties and the revocations and things like that are for really egregious safety violations and intent, right? To get around those rules and to do something unsafe. And we see that. It's not like we don't. We do see people that are really unsafe and intentionally so. But for the most part, if it's an honest mistake, we're going to try to work with you. I don't know, Tim or Rob, you got any thoughts on that?
Well, sure. Yes, the compliance philosophy that the FAA is putting forward, that's the first choice. Is if there's not any intentional or criminal act involved, then we try to employ the compliance action tools that we can to remedy the situation. And only if the person's unwilling and unable, not cooperative, then do we normally employ the enforcement application of fines or suspension or revocation. The worst thing you can ever do would be falsification. That calls for revocation. So you never want to do that, make a false statement on a application or something like that. That's always going to get you in big trouble.
Yeah, I can certainly confirm as an attorney that's represented pilots in enforcement actions that the FAA is typically very reasonable to work with, especially in these more minor situations. They're much more concerned about getting people into compliance and trained and safe than they are the outright punishment. So I certainly would echo your comments there. It appears we have no other questions. So if you would have any closing comments, Don or Tim or Robert, we really thank you for being here. It's a great opportunity to have some FAA folks interacting directly with our students, and we really appreciate your efforts to educate pilots across the board and around the country on these illegal charter issues. Definitely an important topic.
We thank you for your time and in attendance. And again, questions are never a bad thing. We welcome them and learn to ask questions as you're going through your aviation career, for sure. So we really appreciate being here.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. That will conclude. I'll go ahead and log us off. Thank you to all of our attendees and have a nice day.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.